I am William Crawford. I am 70 years old and somehow still processing the deepest betrayal a father could ever experience. As the founder of a multi-million-dollar commercial heating and cooling empire, I spent my entire life building a legacy to provide for my family. Last month, during an upscale dinner meant to honor my late wife, my son slammed his scotch glass on the table, pointing a finger directly in my face. "Stop wasting my money," he hissed. I did not scream. I simply looked at him in dead silence. The very next day, I emptied every single bank account he thought he controlled, and I disappeared completely. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. Columbus, Ohio. It was a bitterly cold Tuesday evening in November. The kind of freezing wind that cuts straight through your overcoat and settles deep into your bones, much like the grief I still carried every single day. We were sitting in a dimly lit, high-end steakhouse downtown. I was paying, of course. I always paid. The dinner was supposed to be a sacred occasion. We were gathered to mark the 3rd anniversary of the passing of my wife Diane. Diane was my absolute rock. She was the woman who stood by my side when I was just a 20-something kid, hauling heavy industrial air conditioning units out of a rusted Ford van. Back then, I was busting my knuckles open every single day, working 90-hour weeks just to keep the lights on. She was the heart of our family, the quiet strength behind Crawford Commercial HVAC. Together, through decades of sheer grit and relentless sacrifice, we grew that tiny operation into a $40 million enterprise. Now sitting at this luxurious table, it was just me, my 35-year-old son Derek, and his wife Monica. Derek had taken over as the chief executive officer of the company exactly 1 year ago. I had stepped back, taking the title of chairman, believing it was finally time to let the next generation lead. Monica, a former real estate agent with a dangerous taste for flashy designer labels and exclusive country clubs, sat next to him. She was casually sipping a $30 glass of imported wine, looking bored and completely detached from the emotional significance of the evening. The ambiance in the restaurant was refined and peaceful. Soft jazz music played in the background. Crystal glasses clinked in toasts and waiters moved quietly around the dining room. But our table felt suffocatingly heavy. There was a palpable toxic tension hanging in the air that I had been trying to ignore for months. Derek had been acting strange, distant, and increasingly arrogant, but I had continuously made excuses for him. I told myself he was simply adjusting to the immense pressure of running a massive corporation. I was wrong. When the waiter cleared our main courses and poured the last of the wine, I felt it was the right moment to share a personal decision. It was a decision that had been bringing me a rare sense of comfort during a difficult week of mourning. I reached into the breast pocket of my tailored suit jacket and pulled out my personal leather-bound checkbook. I set it gently on the crisp white tablecloth. I looked directly at Derek, searching desperately for a trace of his mother in his eyes. "I have been thinking a lot about your mother this week," I said, keeping my voice steady, calm, and low. "You know how much she loved the St. Jude Community Church. That old building has been struggling with a collapsing roof for over 5 years. Diane always talked about fixing it for them. So to honor her memory tonight, I am going to write a check for $50,000 from my personal savings account to cover the complete restoration of the church roof." I expected a simple nod of approval. I expected perhaps a shared moment of grief, a quiet acknowledgement of the incredible woman who gave him life. I expected my son to understand that this was a deeply personal tribute to the very foundation of our family. Instead, the reaction I received was instantaneous, visceral, and violently explosive. Derek snatched his heavy crystal scotch glass from the table and slammed it down with such brute, uncontrolled force that the stem completely shattered in his grip. The sharp, terrifying crack of breaking glass echoed instantly through the elegant dining room. Several patrons at nearby tables stopped their conversations and turned their heads in shock. Jagged shards of crystal ice cubes and amber liquid spilled wildly across the white linen, soaking into the pristine fabric like a dark, ugly stain. Derek leaned aggressively across the table, invading my personal space. His face flushed a dark, furious red, the veins in his neck bulging against his expensive silk tie. He thrust his index finger directly into my face, his eyes wide, manic, and completely unhinged. "Stop wasting my money." He hissed the words with a venomous, guttural intensity that carried effortlessly over the soft jazz music. "What the hell are you doing writing 50 grand checks to a useless church? Are you losing your mind?" Underneath the table, I heard a sharp, painful thud. Monica had violently kicked his shin, her eyes darting nervously around the room, panicking at the unwanted attention of the wealthy onlookers. Derek flinched from the kick, but his furious, hateful glare remained locked entirely on me. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving under his custom Italian suit jacket. A jacket completely paid for by the massive empire I built from nothing. I did not flinch. I did not raise my hands. I did not yell back. I just froze completely solid, staring into the eyes of the absolute stranger sitting across from me. The words echoed in my mind with a deafening, paralyzing roar. My money. He had just called my personal savings, the money I bled and sweat for over 4 grueling decades, his money. I had spent 28 years breathing in toxic fiberglass insulation. I had frozen on commercial rooftops in the dead of winter. I had sacrificed my own youth and health so he would never have to know the bitter taste of poverty. I stepped back from the daily grind for just 1 single year. And in that unbelievably short amount of time, his entitlement had mutated into something terrifyingly monstrous. He truly believed he owned my wealth. He truly believed he owned me. The silence that followed was suffocating. The entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the older man to explode, to cause a scene, to put the disrespectful son in his place. But I am not a man who fights in public. I am a man who observes, calculates, and executes. I slowly reached out, picked up my checkbook, and slid it back into my breast pocket. I did not utter a single word of defense or anger. I stood up slowly from the table, my posture perfectly straight. I reached into my wallet, pulled out 2 crisp $100 bills, and dropped them onto the soaked, glass-covered tablecloth to cover the ruined meal. I turned my back on my son and his wife. I walked out of the restaurant, pushing through the heavy wooden doors and stepping out into the freezing Columbus night. The chilling wind hit my face, but I barely felt it. My mind was completely clear. My heart, though broken, was beating with a cold, terrifying new purpose. I knew right then, without a shadow of a doubt, that the war for my life had already started. I would not be a victim. I would be the architect of their absolute and total destruction. I woke up before dawn the next morning. Decades of waking up at 4:30 to load trucks and review blueprints had permanently hardwired my internal clock. The house was painfully quiet. It was a massive, sprawling brick estate in Upper Arlington that Diane and I had purchased 20 years ago. Without her, it just felt like an empty museum. I brewed a pot of black coffee and sat at the kitchen island, watching the frost cling to the bare branches of the oak trees in the backyard. My mind was replaying the events of the previous night. Derek shattering the glass, the rage in his eyes, the terrifying sense of entitlement. My money, he had said. The coffee tasted like ash in my mouth. By 8 o'clock, the winter sun was barely breaking through the thick gray Ohio clouds. That was when the heavy brass knocker on my front door echoed through the silent hallway. I was not expecting anyone. I set my mug down slowly, walked across the expansive foyer, and I carefully opened the heavy front door. Derek and Monica were standing on my front porch. The freezing wind was whipping Monica's perfectly styled blonde hair across her face. Derek was holding a massive shrink-wrapped Harry and David fruit basket, complete with an oversized, ridiculous gold ribbon. He looked awful. His eyes were bloodshot, and his skin had the pale, clammy sheen of a man who had spent the entire night nursing a severe Scotch hangover. Monica, on the other hand, looked impeccably put together in a tailored cashmere coat holding a pair of expensive leather gloves. She wore a bright, incredibly forced smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "Dad." Derek said, his voice raspy and remarkably smaller than the booming roar he had used at the steakhouse. "Can we come in, please? We really need to talk to you." I stared at them for a long, heavy moment. My instincts, the same instincts that had saved my company from bankruptcy during 3 separate economic recessions, told me to shut the heavy wooden door right in their faces. But a good businessman never closes a door until he knows exactly what the person on the other side is trying to sell him. I stepped back silently, pulling the door wide to let the freezing air and my uninvited guests inside. They stepped into the warm foyer, bringing the scent of expensive perfume and nervous sweat with them. Derek practically shoved the heavy fruit basket into my hands. I took it, feeling the absurd weight of the overpriced pears and gourmet cheeses, and carried it into the kitchen. I set it down on the granite counter, without removing the ridiculous gold ribbon. I gestured toward the living room, leading them into the formal sitting area that Diane had decorated with so much love. I took my usual armchair by the fireplace. Derek and Monica sat tightly together on the edge of the long leather sofa, looking like 2 guilty teenagers called into the principal's office. The silence in the room stretched out thick and suffocating. I did not offer them coffee. I did not offer them water. I simply crossed my hands in my lap and waited for them to speak. In negotiations, the first person to break the silence is usually the one who loses. I had the patience of a stone. Derek cracked first. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and buried his face in his hands for a brief theatrical second. "Dad, I am so incredibly sorry about last night." He began, his voice laced with manufactured, heavy remorse. "My behavior at the restaurant was completely unacceptable. I was out of line, and I deeply regret causing a scene, especially on the anniversary of Mom passing away. I know how much that meant to you." I remained perfectly still, my expression neutral. I did not offer a nod of forgiveness. Derek swallowed hard, shifting uncomfortably on the leather cushion. "It is just the stress, Dad. The pressure of running Crawford Commercial HVAC is eating me alive. We are expanding into the Cleveland and Cincinnati markets simultaneously, and the supply chain issues are causing massive delays with our industrial rooftop units. I have not slept a full night in 3 weeks. Last night I had way too much scotch on an empty stomach. When you pulled out that checkbook to give away $50,000, I just panicked," I snapped. "I felt like the weight of the entire company was crushing my chest, and I took it out on you. Please, you have to believe me. That is not who I am." I did not mean those words. I listened to his excuse, analyzing every syllable. He was blaming the alcohol. He was blaming the supply chain. He was blaming the very company I had built and handed over to him on a silver platter. He was taking absolutely zero genuine accountability for the hatred and entitlement that had poured out of his mouth. Before I could even formulate a response to his hollow apology, Monica smoothly leaned forward and placed a manicured, comforting hand over Derek's knee. She looked at me with an expression of profound, sickeningly sweet concern. "It is the absolute truth, William," she said softly. Her voice was pure velvet, dripping with calculated empathy. "Derek has been working himself to the bone to make you proud. But honestly, we have both been terribly worried about you lately. You have been living alone in this massive house for 3 years now. Grief does strange things to the mind." My heart slowed to a steady, cold rhythm. I looked at her. "Worried about me?" I asked, my tone dangerously flat. "Yes," Monica continued without missing a beat. "You are so generous, William. Sometimes too generous. We have been reading these awful reports about elder fraud, about scammers and shady organizations preying on wealthy older men who live alone. People who manipulate grief to extract large donations. When you pulled out your checkbook last night to hand over 50 grand to that old church, Derek just panicked because he wants to protect you. He meant to say our family money, not his money. He was just terrified that you were being taken advantage of by opportunistic strangers. She smiled, tilting her head with a look of practiced maternal concern. It was a brilliant, highly plausible lie. She was painting my act of charity as a symptom of vulnerable senility, and painting Derek's violent outburst as an act of protective love. That is why we quietly took the necessary initiative to set up a family protection trust last week, Monica added smoothly. Just to shield your personal assets from potential scammers. It is just a very standard and necessary safety measure for older high-net-worth individuals. I nodded slowly, forcing the hard lines of my face to soften, pretending to accept their seemingly genuine apology. But deep inside my chest, my 40 years of corporate business instincts were screaming a deafening warning. The terrifying phrase "family protection trust" immediately sounded suspiciously like a completely permanent and unbreakable legal cage. After they finally left my house, taking their hollow apologies and their expensive fruit basket with them, the silence of the massive estate felt heavier than before. The air inside the foyer was thick with the lingering scent of Monica's perfume and the bitter aftertaste of their rehearsed performance. I needed to clear my head. I needed to be somewhere that felt real, somewhere far away from the polished granite and the suffocating silence. I went out to the detached garage and pulled the canvas cover off my vintage 1978 Ford pickup truck. It was the very first vehicle I ever bought brand new with cash from the HVAC business. It was forest green, meticulously maintained, and completely devoid of modern touchscreens or digital trackers. Driving it always reminded me of who I really was before the millions, before the corporate boardroom, before the greed infected my family. It was just a machine of pure steel and combustion, honest and straightforward. I turned the ignition key, and the heavy engine roared to life, filling the garage with the rich smell of exhaust and old leather. I backed the truck out into the freezing Columbus afternoon. The sky was the color of bruised iron threatening snow. I drove toward the industrial side of town to a small, independent mechanic shop owned by a man named Arthur. Arthur was a guy who worked with his hands, a man who understood the value of hard labor. I had scheduled a simple winter tune-up a few weeks prior. It was nothing major, just new spark plugs, fresh oil, and a quick inspection of the heating core. The drive was cold, but incredibly grounding. The heavy steering wheel and the manual transmission required my complete focus, allowing me to push Derek and his family protection trust out of my immediate thoughts, at least for a little while. I pulled into the gravel lot of the shop, the tires crunching loudly over the frozen stones. Arthur wiped his grease-stained hands on a red shop rag and greeted me with a warm, genuine smile. We spent the next hour talking about engines, the incoming winter storms, and the reliable durability of classic American manufacturing. It was a simple, honest interaction. There were no hidden agendas, no calculated words, just two men talking about things that made absolute and perfect sense. When the work was finally completely finished, Arthur walked behind the scratched wooden counter to ring me up. The total came out to exactly $415. It was a completely trivial amount of money for a man in my financial position. I reached into my thick leather wallet and pulled out my heavy black card. This was a private wealth management card, an account with no preset spending limit tied directly to a massive reservoir of liquid cash I had accumulated over decades of relentless work. I handed the heavy metal card to Arthur. He took it, admiring the solid weight of it for a brief second, and swiped it through his dusty electronic payment terminal. We continued chatting about the local college football scores while the machine processed the transaction. A few seconds later, the terminal let out a sharp, harsh, negative beep. Arthur frowned, looking down at the small digital screen. He wiped the magnetic strip on his apron and swiped the card a second time. The machine beeped again. The exact same sharp, annoying negative sound. Arthur looked up at me, an apologetic and deeply embarrassed expression washing over his weathered face. "William, I am really sorry," he said, keeping his voice incredibly low so the other mechanics in the garage would not hear. "The machine is saying the card is declined." I stared at him, completely uncomprehending. Declined? The single word felt like a physical blow. I had millions of dollars sitting in that specific account. It was an account I used strictly for personal expenses, entirely separated from the corporate finances of Crawford Commercial HVAC. I had never, not once in my entire adult life, had a credit card declined. The sheer impossibility of the situation made my chest suddenly tighten. I forced a calm, reassuring smile, masking the sudden spike of anxiety shooting through my veins. "It must be a security flag," I told Arthur, smoothly pulling my phone from my pocket. "Sometimes the bank freezes the card if they suspect fraudulent activity." "Give me just one moment, Arthur. I will call my private wealth manager directly and have them clear it up immediately." I stepped outside the garage, pulling my heavy wool coat tight against the bitter wind. I dialed the direct private extension for my personal banking manager. His name was Richard, a senior executive at a major national bank who handled my portfolio personally. Normally, Richard answered on the very first ring, greeting me with profound, almost overly eager respect. This time, the phone rang 5 times, 6 times, 7 times. Finally, there was a sharp click. Richard answered the line, but his voice did not project the usual confident professional warmth. He sounded hesitant, breathless, and incredibly terrified. "Hello, William," he stammered, his words stumbling over one another in a frantic rush. "Richard," I said, keeping my tone perfectly measured but incredibly firm. "I am standing at a mechanic shop in the freezing cold, and my primary card was just declined for a $400 charge. I need you to lift whatever security hold is currently blocking my funds right this second." The silence on the other end of the line was absolute and absolutely terrifying. I could actually hear Richard swallowing hard, taking a shaky, incredibly unsteady breath. "William, I am so sorry," he finally whispered, his voice trembling with genuine fear. "I cannot lift the hold. I no longer have the legal authorization to allow you access to those funds." The freezing wind whipped across the gravel lot, biting into my exposed skin. But the sudden cold I felt internally was infinitely worse. "What are you talking about, Richard? It is my account. It is my money." "William, please listen to me very carefully," Richard pleaded, his voice dropping to a frantic, hushed whisper. "First thing this morning, your son Derek and a team of 3 corporate attorneys walked directly into my office. They presented a binding court order signed by a local judge. Your accounts have not been flagged for fraud. Your accounts have been entirely frozen under a co-conservatorship order. Derek has been granted temporary emergency control over all your personal finances, a conservatorship. I am a perfectly healthy and capable man. My mind is completely sharp. My blood runs absolutely cold as the horrifying reality slams directly into my chest. The plausible lie from the morning completely shatters into a million jagged pieces right before my eyes. The Family Protection Trust was not designed to shield my money from outside scammers. It was a weapon designed to meticulously strip me of my independence. They aren't protecting my money at all. They have legally locked me out of my own life. The silent war for my absolute freedom has officially and irreversibly begun today. I hung up the phone and stood frozen in the biting winter wind. The gravel under my boots felt unsteady, as if the very earth had suddenly shifted on its axis. A conservatorship. The sheer magnitude of that legal maneuver echoed through my mind, drowning out the ambient noise of the busy mechanic shop behind me. Derek had not just frozen my personal checking accounts. He had executed a calculated, precise legal strike to strip me of my fundamental human autonomy. To the state of Ohio, I was suddenly a legally incapacitated old man, entirely dependent on the supposedly benevolent protection of a son who had orchestrated my financial imprisonment. I did not waste time yelling at the sky or cursing my fate. Panic is a luxury reserved for the unprepared. Instead, I climbed back into the freezing cab of my 1978 Ford pickup truck. I slammed the heavy metal door shut, gripped the freezing steering wheel, and jammed the transmission into gear. I had to see the extent of the damage. I had to know exactly how far the infection had spread into the empire I had built from nothing. I drove straight toward the downtown business district, navigating the gray, slush-covered streets with mechanical precision. My destination was the massive glass and steel headquarters of Crawford Commercial, HVAC. I had laid the literal foundation for that building 20 years ago. I knew every structural beam, every ventilation shaft, and every hidden access panel. It was a monument to my life of relentless labor. But as the towering structure came into view against the bleak winter sky, it no longer looked like my crowning achievement. It looked like a fortress currently occupied by a hostile enemy force. I parked my truck in the adjacent parking garage, intentionally avoiding my reserved spot near the front entrance. I wanted to enter quietly, without drawing attention to my sudden arrival. I walked through the sliding glass doors and stepped into the expansive marble-floored lobby. The familiar hum of corporate activity washed over me. Phones were ringing softly at the reception desk. Employees in sharp suits walked briskly across the polished stone, and the low murmur of business deals filled the warm air. Nobody paid any special attention to the 70-year-old man walking toward the back corridor. I bypassed the main reception desk and headed directly for the private executive elevator bank. This was a secure access point, designed exclusively for top-tier management. I reached into my coat pocket and retrieved my heavy gold-trimmed founder badge. It was a unique keycard that granted me unrestricted total access to every single floor-secure room and digital terminal within the entire global corporate network. I held the badge up to the sleek black security scanner, mounted beside the polished steel elevator doors. I anticipated the familiar soft green glow and the quiet metallic click of the unlocking mechanism. Instead, the scanner let out a harsh, abrupt beep. A bright, glaring red light illuminated the digital panel. The display read, "Access denied." I stood there staring at the red light. I swiped the badge a second time. The machine beeped again, flashing that identical, mocking red warning. "Access denied." The reality of the situation washed over me like a bucket of ice water. Derek had not just locked me out of my personal bank accounts. He had systematically purged my digital identity from the corporate security mainframe. I was officially a ghost inside the very walls I had paid to construct. My jaw tightened, but I did not create a scene in the lobby. I simply took a step back and leaned casually against the marble wall, blending into the background like an ordinary visitor waiting for a scheduled appointment. I watched the flow of employees moving through the security gates. After about 10 minutes, I spotted a young, incredibly nervous-looking intern balancing a towering stack of cardboard document boxes and 4 oversized cups of coffee. He was fumbling with his security lanyard, desperately trying to scan his badge while keeping the coffee cups from spilling. I recognized the opportunity instantly. As the intern finally managed to trigger the green light on the standard elevator bank, I moved with a speed and fluid precision that completely belied my 70 years of age. I stepped directly behind him, slipping smoothly through the sliding glass security turnstile right before the heavy doors snapped shut. The intern jumped, nearly dropping his precarious load of cardboard boxes, and looked over his shoulder with wide, terrified eyes. I offered him a calm, reassuring smile, projecting the absolute authority of a man who belonged exactly where he was standing. "Do not worry about it, son," I said smoothly, reaching out to steady the top box of documents. I left my badge up on the top floor. "Just hit the button for the executive suite for me, would you?" The young man nodded frantically, his hands visibly shaking as he pressed the glowing button for the top floor. He had absolutely no idea he was aiding an unauthorized infiltration. The elevator ascended smoothly, carrying me upward into the heart of the occupied territory. The doors slid open with a soft chime. I stepped off the elevator and walked silently down the pristine carpeted hallway of the executive floor. The walls were lined with framed photographs of our major industrial projects. I moved like a shadow, making absolutely no sound. I bypassed the main boardroom and headed straight toward the corner suite that used to belong to my chief financial officer. As I approached the heavy glass door, I stopped dead in my tracks. I peered through the slightly parted blinds. Monica, my son's wife, was sitting behind the massive mahogany desk. She held absolutely no official title in my company. She had no business degree and zero corporate experience. Yet she was casually leaning back in the expensive leather chair, sipping sparkling water. I noticed her left wrist immediately. She was wearing a brand new diamond-encrusted Cartier watch that easily cost $15,000. But the jewelry was not the most horrifying detail. Spread across the mahogany desk were several thick stacks of legal documents. I recognized the distinctive watermarks immediately. She was holding a heavy gold pen, casually signing real estate transfer deeds printed directly on my company's official letterhead. She was actively liquidating Crawford commercial property assets. They were quietly dismantling my entire corporate infrastructure, piece by piece, converting brick and steel into liquid cash without any oversight or legal board approval. She was selling off the physical warehouses and distribution centers I had purchased decades ago, likely funneling the massive profits into whatever offshore shadow accounts they had secretly established. My chest burned with a furious, explosive heat, but my mind remained perfectly cold. I absolutely did not push the heavy glass door open. I did not storm into the office to confront her. Confrontation without leverage is just noise, and I required absolute leverage. I memorized the scene, turned around, and walked silently back down the carpeted hallway. The silent, catastrophic war for my ultimate survival had officially begun. I got into my heavy vintage Ford and merged onto the interstate, heading far away from the polished glass and steel of the downtown business district. A light snow had just started to fall, coating the cold, gray Ohio highways. I knew better than to contact the corporate legal department at Crawford Commercial HVAC. Those lawyers were technically on my payroll, but their daily checks were now signed by Derek. I needed someone whose loyalty belonged exclusively to me. I needed a man who understood the dirty, brutal reality of corporate warfare and possessed the stomach to fight back. I drove 20 miles outside the city limits to a rusted neon-lit diner, sitting alone on a desolate stretch of highway. It was the kind of place where tired truck drivers drank burnt coffee and nobody asked any questions. I parked around the back and stepped inside. The air was thick with the smell of old cooking grease and cheap bacon. Sitting in the back corner booth, nursing a black coffee, was Rick Dalton. Rick was my former attack dog attorney. He had aggressively defended my company against frivolous lawsuits and hostile takeover attempts for over 30 years before retiring to a quiet life of fishing and bourbon. He possessed a brilliant legal mind and an absolute absence of moral hesitation when protecting his clients. I slid into the cracked vinyl booth across from him. He simply took a sip of his coffee and intensely studied my face. "You look like a man who just watched his own funeral." Rick said, his voice gravelly and low. I laid out the entire timeline with surgical precision. I told him about the horrific anniversary dinner, the shattered crystal glass, and the terrifying rage in Derek's eyes when he screamed about his money. I detailed the theatrical apology the next morning, the fruit basket, and Monica's smooth lie about setting up a family protection trust to shield me from elder fraud. I watched Rick's eyes narrow as I explained the declined card at the mechanic shop, the terrified bank manager, and the sudden reality of the court-ordered co-conservatorship. Finally, I told him about the flashing red light at the executive elevator. I described sneaking up to the top floor and watching Monica, a woman with zero official corporate authority, casually signing commercial real estate transfer deeds on my company letterhead. I told him she was actively liquidating our downtown supply warehouses. Rick set his ceramic coffee mug down heavily on the table. He did not look shocked. He looked deeply, intensely analytical. "A conservatorship," Rick murmured, shaking his head slowly, in genuine disbelief. "That is the absolute nuclear option, William. They did not just temporarily lock your checking accounts. They successfully convinced a presiding judge that you are severely mentally incapacitated. They essentially legally declared that you are no longer a functioning adult capable of managing your own daily affairs. It takes extensive, rigorous documentation to pull a stunt like that off. They would absolutely need a licensed medical professional to sign a sworn affidavit confirming your severe cognitive decline. They have been meticulously planning this corporate and personal coup for many months. I need to know exactly how deep this treacherous knife goes, I said, keeping my voice incredibly steady despite the massive adrenaline spike pounding violently in my chest. I need to know exactly what they have stolen, and I need to know it right this second. Rick did not hesitate for a single moment. He reached into his worn leather briefcase and pulled out a battered laptop. He flipped it open right there on the sticky diner table, completely ignoring the young waitress who walked by to top off his mug. He connected to a secure, encrypted mobile hotspot and began typing furiously. The rapid clacking of the plastic keyboard was the only sound between us for several agonizing suspended minutes. Rick was entirely bypassing the standard public search engines, digging directly into the deeply buried county public records and restricted state judicial databases. I carefully watched the reflection of the glowing screen against his thick reading glasses. His jaw tightened remarkably. The Family Protection Trust is a real entity, Rick said, his eyes scanning the dense legal jargon rapidly scrolling across his monitor. But it is not a protective shield, William. It is a massive financial vacuum. They deliberately structured it as an ironclad, irrevocable trust, specifically naming Derek as the primary controlling trustee and Monica as the secondary. They have already aggressively funneled the vast majority of your liquid personal assets into it. The fraudulent conservatorship gave them the absolute legal authority to move your money instantly without requiring a single authorizing signature from you. You are completely legally locked out of your own life savings. But those commercial real estate transfers you clearly saw Monica signing, that is what truly worries me the absolute most. They are rapidly liquidating your prime commercial properties to immediately generate massive amounts of highly untraceable cash. Rick fell completely silent again, his fingers flying rapidly across the keys as he drastically shifted his search parameters. He swiftly opened a brand new tab, pulling up the secure county property tax assessments and residential deed records. He carefully typed in the specific address of my massive, sprawling brick estate located in Upper Arlington, the beautiful home where Diane and I had joyfully raised our entire family, the quiet home where I had slept peacefully just last night, the grand home I had completely and proudly paid off 20 full years ago. The digital loading icon spun in a continuous, agonizing circle for what felt like an absolute eternity. Finally, the page successfully populated with a dense, complicated block of official government text. Rick abruptly stopped typing. He took a slow, incredibly heavy breath and looked directly up at me. His expression was significantly grimmer than I had ever seen it in our entire 30-year professional relationship. "William," he said quietly, his voice carrying a dark weight that made my stomach instantly drop. "I need you to brace yourself." Rick turned the laptop completely around and slid it across the sticky table so it faced me directly. I looked straight down at the glowing screen. There, in stark black and white digital text, was the official deed to my Upper Arlington estate. But my name was completely gone. In its place, listed as the absolute sole owners of the property, were Derek and Monica Crawford. The date of the fraudulent transfer was stamped clearly at the bottom. It had been executed 3 weeks ago. My signature had been entirely flawlessly forged. My blood ran completely cold. The chilling reality of my dire situation finally crystallized with absolute, terrifying clarity. I did not just lose my company or my bank accounts. I had literally lost my only physical sanctuary. If I went back to that house right now and angrily confronted them with this profound, unforgivable betrayal, they would not just simply ignore me. They could legally evict me on the very spot, call the local police, and have me immediately arrested for trespassing in what used to be my own home. I walked out of that greasy diner with Rick Dalton's grim warning ringing in my ears. The freezing night air hit my face, but I felt absolutely nothing. My own son had forged my signature. He had stolen the very house where his mother had rocked him to sleep. If I drove back to my estate right now, I would be walking into a legal trap. Derek and Monica could have me arrested for trespassing. I climbed into the cab of my vintage pickup truck and drove to a modest motel on the edge of the county line, paying in cash. I sat on the lumpy mattress and stared at the wall. Panic is the ultimate enemy of logic. I had to dismantle Derek's illusion of absolute control. To do that, I needed the undeniable proof of his corporate theft. Derek always looked at me like I was an obsolete dinosaur. He genuinely believed that because I did not understand modern cloud computing, I was completely blind to the internal mechanics of the company. He thought his newly installed corporate firewalls and digital tokens had permanently locked me out of the accounting systems. He had successfully deactivated my administrative keycard and revoked my remote access passwords. But Derek was arrogant, and arrogance breeds catastrophic oversights. He had completely forgotten the foundational history of the building. 20 years ago, I personally oversaw the installation of the original internal server architecture. Before cloud storage became the corporate standard, we relied on a heavily fortified physical mainframe located deep in the concrete basement of the headquarters. When we transitioned to newer systems, I mandated that the core mainframe remain actively tethered to the network as a fail-safe redundancy. I had my engineers install a hardwired master override protocol. It was an off-the-grid access terminal bypassing every external firewall. It was strictly tied to my physical biometrics. I did not need a digital password. I just needed my own body. I reached out to Mike Navarro, a highly resourceful private investigator. I kept on retainer for years. I met Navarro in the deserted parking lot of a grocery store at midnight. I did not give him the emotional details of my son betraying me. I handed him an envelope of cash and told him I needed a military-grade encrypted hard drive with the highest possible transfer speed. Navarro nodded, handed over a heavy black metal casing, and drove away without asking a single question. I sat in my truck, watching the dashboard clock slowly tick forward. I needed the building to be completely abandoned. I needed the late-night cleaning crews to finish their rounds. I waited until the digital numbers glowing on my dashboard clicked to exactly 2 o'clock in the morning. Then I put the truck in gear and drove back toward the glass and steel fortress I had built. I parked 2 blocks away in a dark alleyway. I pulled the collar of my heavy wool coat up and walked briskly toward the rear loading docks of the Crawford headquarters. Derek had recently spent hundreds of thousands of dollars upgrading the perimeter security, installing high-definition cameras and motion sensors at every main entrance. But he did not know about the old maintenance tunnel. Back when the building was first constructed, I insisted on a subterranean service corridor that connected the primary electrical grid to the municipal storm drains. The entrance was hidden behind a rusted industrial dumpster, completely out of the sightline of his fancy new cameras. I slipped behind the steel bin and found the old iron grate. I pulled a heavy crowbar from my coat, jammed it under the iron edge, and pulled with all the strength my 70-year-old arms could muster. The grate groaned and lifted. I slid down into the damp darkness of the tunnel. I navigated the narrow passage using a small tactical flashlight, my boots splashing softly against the shallow puddles. I reached the heavy reinforced steel door at the end of the tunnel. This was the true back door into the facility, a door that did not rely on modern electronic keypads. I reached into my pocket, pulled out a heavy brass skeleton key I had carried for 2 decades, and slid it into the mechanical lock. The tumblers clicked perfectly into place. I pulled the door open and stepped silently into the sub-basement of the Crawford headquarters. The air down here was cold, dry, and heavily filtered. The ambient hum of massive cooling fans echoed off the concrete walls. I walked through the dimly lit corridors, bypassing the massive electrical panels. I headed straight for the central server room. It was a standalone concrete bunker secured behind a thick security door. I approached the access panel. It was an older model untouched by Derek's technological renovations. I placed my right hand onto the glass surface of the scanner. A thin line of red light slowly swept across my palm, mapping the unique ridges of my fingerprints. The machine let out a mechanical hum, processing the physical data. Next, a small digital lens extended from the wall panel. I leaned forward, aligning my right eye with the glowing green targeting reticle. The scanner pulsed, casting a bright beam of light directly into my pupil. It was analyzing the complex vascular structure of my retina cross, referencing the biological markers against the foundational code of the master override protocol. For 3 agonizingly long seconds, the terminal remained entirely silent. My heart pounded heavily against my ribs. If the engineers had dismantled this system without telling me, the silent alarms would trigger immediately. I would be trapped in the basement waiting for the police to arrive and arrest me for corporate espionage in my own building. Then the heavy steel door emitted a loud, satisfying electronic clack. A thick green light illuminated the access panel. The heavy deadbolts retracted smoothly into the walls. I grabbed the handle and pulled the door open. I stepped into the freezing server room. Rows of towering black server racks stood like silent sentinels, blinking with thousands of tiny blue and green lights. The noise of the cooling units was deafening, but to me it sounded like absolute victory. I walked to the console at the center of the room. I flipped the cover off the master override port, exposing the raw physical connection to the corporate network. I unzipped my coat, pulled out the military-grade encrypted hard drive Navarro had provided, and plugged the thick black cable directly into the mainframe terminal. A command prompt instantly booted on the dusty monitor. The system had successfully recognized my biometric authority. I was fully in. I typed in a rapid sequence of legacy command codes, bypassing Derek's modern accounting software and diving straight into the raw, unfiltered root directories. I targeted the hidden financial folders, the deeply buried files that Derek thought he had perfectly concealed. I hit the execution. The progress bar flashed onto the screen. I stood alone in the freezing basement, watching the digital numbers climb as I systematically began downloading the last 12 months of Derek's secret shadow accounting. The blue glow of the progress bar crept across the monitor like a glacier. I stood in the freezing chill of the sub-basement, my breath forming faint white clouds in the highly filtered air. The military-grade hard drive hummed quietly, digesting massive blocks of compressed financial data. I knew the complete transfer would take at least 20 minutes. 20 minutes was a dangerous eternity when you were infiltrating your own corporate headquarters in the dead of night. To pass the agonizing time and to satisfy the burning anxiety in my chest, I opened a secondary window on the terminal. I bypassed the main directory and manually accessed the raw data packets filtering through the network bridge. I wanted to see exactly what Derek had been hiding behind his fabricated firewalls. I opened the master ledger for the third quarter. The spreadsheet populated instantly, filling the screen with thousands of individual line items. At a casual, superficial glance, everything looked perfectly normal. The payroll distributions were accurate. The standard supplier invoices matched the quarterly projections. The overhead costs for our distribution centers aligned with historical averages. Derek had hired someone incredibly skilled to paint this beautiful, fraudulent picture. But I did not build a $40 million empire by looking at the surface. I knew the intricate rhythm of this company better than I knew my own heartbeat. I isolated the outgoing vendor payments and filtered them by origination date, specifically targeting the exact month Derek officially assumed the role of Chief Executive Officer. The true story emerged almost immediately. Hidden beneath the massive, legitimate purchases of industrial copper piping and commercial-grade refrigerants, there was a steady, rhythmic bleed. I found a recurring weekly outgoing wire transfer routed to an entity listed as Apex Logistics Solutions. The invoices were vaguely coded as expedited supply chain management fees. They were consistently billed at $45,000 a week. I cross-referenced our approved vendor database. Apex Logistics Solutions did not exist in our system before last November. I ran a secondary search through the state corporate registry database using the raw command terminal. Apex Logistics Solutions was a limited liability company registered to a generic post office box in Delaware. The listed managing director was a corporate proxy firm. It was a classic textbook shell company. My son was bleeding Crawford commercial HVAC dry. I kept digging, my fingers moving across the plastic keyboard with a cold, mechanical fury. Apex was just the beginning. I uncovered 5 more ghost entities: Horizon Strategic Ventures, Summit Global Purchasing, Pinnacle Consulting Partners. Every single one of them was a fabricated shell siphoning hundreds of thousands of dollars out of our operating capital under the guise of vague administrative services and imaginary consulting fees. Over the last 12 months, Derek had effortlessly embezzled nearly $4 million directly from the primary operational accounts. The sheer scale of the theft was staggering, but as I scrutinized the balance sheets, a terrifying inconsistency caught my eye. $4 million was a massive hemorrhage, but Crawford Commercial HVAC generated $40 million in annual revenue. A $4 million deficit would certainly hurt our quarterly profit margins, but it would not completely bankrupt the infrastructure. Yet the internal cash flow indicators were flashing severe red warnings. The company was drowning in a severe liquidity crisis. I dug deeper into the central collateral registries, holding my breath as the encrypted files slowly decrypted onto the screen. What I found next made the physical embezzlement look like a minor administrative error. Derek was not merely stealing cash to fund his luxurious lifestyle. He was actively utilizing the entire corporate entity as collateral. I opened a deeply buried directory labeled Offshore Liabilities. My son had taken the physical assets of Crawford Commercial HVAC, the heavy machinery, the sprawling distribution warehouses, the fleet of 300 service trucks, and he had legally pledged them against massive, highly leveraged offshore margin accounts. He was borrowing tens of millions of dollars from unregulated international financial institutions, using the lifeblood of my company to guarantee the massive loans. He was funneling the borrowed capital into high-risk, incredibly volatile foreign exchange markets and aggressive short-term investment strategies. He was playing the ultimate game of financial roulette gambling with the foundation of the empire I had sacrificed my life to build. If those offshore margin calls suddenly failed, the international lenders would legally seize every asset tied to the Crawford name. They would take the warehouses. They would take the trucks. They would take the tools right out of my employees' hands. Derek had effectively strapped a massive financial bomb to the very core of the company, and the timer was ticking down rapidly. My chest tightened with a suffocating, blinding rage. I gripped the edge of the metal server rack, my knuckles turning completely white. He had looked me straight in the eye at that high-end steakhouse, slammed his crystal glass on the table, and screamed about me wasting his money. He was projecting his own catastrophic financial ruin directly onto me. He needed the Family Protection Trust to absorb my personal wealth because he had decimated the corporate wealth. The progress bar on the monitor finally hit 100%. A green notification box popped onto the screen confirming the massive data transfer was completely successful. I ejected the military-grade hard drive from the port and slipped it deep into the inside pocket of my thick winter wool coat. I closed the raw command terminal, wiping my digital footprint from the master override registry to ensure Derek's technology team would never realize I had breached their fortress. I sealed the access port tight and stepped back into the dark, freezing concrete corridor of the sub-basement. The heavy steel security door clicked shut loudly behind me, re-engaging the massive internal deadbolts automatically with a heavy thud. I finally possessed the raw financial data. I possessed the undeniable proof of his offshore financial fraud and the devastating, reckless collateralization of my entire life's work. I could hand this encrypted hard drive to the federal authorities in the morning and watch my son be carried away from his office in steel handcuffs. But the raw financial data alone was simply not enough. The accounting ledgers definitively proved the underlying mechanics of the corporate theft, but they completely failed to reveal their tactical strategy. Derek and Monica had successfully orchestrated a fraudulent medical conservatorship to strip away my human rights and steal my home. They obviously possessed a specific, meticulously coordinated physical plan to remove me from the daily equation permanently. I desperately needed to know exactly when they intended to execute their final devastating blow against me. I needed to know their exact timeline before they could manage to blindside me again with another devastating legal or medical attack. I could not simply leave the building tonight and passively wait for their invisible trap to suddenly spring completely shut around my neck. I needed active ears directly inside the executive suite. I absolutely needed to hear every single spoken word they exchanged in the complete, undisturbed privacy of that massive, luxurious corner office. I slipped the heavy encrypted hard drive deeper into my thick wool coat and turned my back on the glowing server banks. The concrete sub-basement was eerily quiet as I retraced my steps through the dimly lit corridors. I had secured the raw financial data, but data was merely a historical record of what Derek had already stolen. I needed forward intelligence. I needed the tactical blueprint of their next move against me. To get that, I had to ascend into the belly of the beast. I bypassed the main service elevator, knowing its digital tracking log would record any movement even with an override command. Instead, I moved toward the central concrete stairwell. The heavy steel fire door groaned slightly as I pulled it open. I began the arduous climb to the top floor of the corporate headquarters. The physical exertion burned in my 70-year-old lungs, but the cold fury radiating through my veins pushed me upward. I climbed past the manufacturing floors, the logistics departments, and the human resources divisions. Every floor represented a distinct chapter of my life, a piece of the sprawling empire I had built with my bare hands and endless sacrifice. Now it was entirely occupied by a son who viewed my legacy as his personal slush fund. I reached the heavy fire doors of the executive level. The corridor beyond was pitch black, illuminated only by the faint ambient glow of emergency exit signs. The thick plush carpeting completely absorbed the sound of my heavy winter boots as I moved silently down the hallway. I passed the boardroom and the senior vice president's suites, keeping my eyes fixed firmly on the massive double doors at the far end of the hall. Derek's corner office, the nerve center of his fraudulent operation. The door was locked with a modern biometric deadbolt, a costly security upgrade he had installed immediately after taking over my position as chief executive officer. He genuinely believed that modern technology made him invincible. He forgot that I was the man who oversaw the installation of the very doors he stood behind. I reached into my pocket and retrieved a small specialized magnetic bypass key. Navarro had provided it to me weeks ago when my suspicions first began to materialize. I slid the thin strip of magnetized metal directly into the microscopic gap between the digital strike plate and the door frame. I wiggled it gently, applying precise pressure until I heard the faint, satisfying click of the mechanical tumbler releasing. The heavy wooden door swung inward on silent hinges. I stepped into the vast executive suite and closed the door softly behind me. The room was bathed in the pale, ghostly light of the winter moon shining through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The sheer opulence of the space was sickening. Derek had completely renovated my old office. He had torn out my practical oak desk and replaced it with a massive slab of imported Italian marble. He had installed a private wet bar and filled the shelves with crystal decanters and bottles of scotch that cost more than my first service van. He was living like a billionaire king on the edge of a catastrophic financial precipice. I walked deliberately across the room and stood directly behind his marble desk. I reached into the inner lining of my coat and pulled out a small sealed plastic envelope. Inside was a piece of military-grade surveillance equipment procured by Mike Navarro. It was a micro-audio transmitter barely the size of a standard coin cell battery. It was equipped with an omnidirectional condenser microphone capable of picking up a mere whisper from 30 feet away. The device was incredibly powerful, but it had one significant vulnerability. It required a continuous power source to maintain an active transmission for more than 48 hours. I could not risk the battery dying before Derek and Monica revealed their final devastating plan. I needed a permanent power supply. I looked down at the right corner of the marble desk. Resting there was a heavy, custom-crafted brass reading lamp. My heart tightened with a sharp, unexpected pang of sorrow. I had commissioned that specific lamp from a local artisan as a gift for Derek on the day I officially promoted him to Chief Executive Officer. It was meant to symbolize the passing of the torch, a beacon to guide him through the difficult decisions of corporate leadership. Now that deeply sentimental gift was going to become the very instrument of his absolute downfall. I pulled a small multi-tool from my pocket and unfolded the precision screwdriver. I carefully laid the heavy brass lamp on its side across the smooth marble surface, making sure not to scratch the polished stone. I removed the protective felt pad from the bottom and began unscrewing the heavy base plate. The tiny metal screws yielded easily to my deliberate, steady pressure. I lifted the base plate away, exposing the internal electrical wiring of the lamp. The thick copper power cord was spliced neatly into the main rotary switch. I took a small pair of wire strippers from my coat and carefully peeled back a 1/4 inch of the black rubber insulation, exposing the live wires. My hands were remarkably steady. The adrenaline focused my vision, allowing me to execute the delicate mechanical work with absolute precision. I took the micro-audio transmitter and examined the 2 tiny power leads extending from its casing. I meticulously wrapped the fragile transmitter leads directly around the exposed copper wires of the desk lamp. I pulled a small roll of black electrical tape from my pocket and tightly wrapped the spliced connections, ensuring there was absolutely no risk of a short circuit. As long as the lamp remained plugged into the wall outlet, the surveillance bug would draw a continuous, undetectable trickle of electricity. The microphone was positioned perfectly flush against the hollow ventilation gap near the base of the brass casing. It was an absolutely flawless, invisible integration. I carefully replaced the heavy base plate, aligning the tiny screws with their original threading. I tightened them down securely and pressed the protective felt pad back into place. I stood the lamp upright and returned it to its exact original position on the right corner of the marble desk. I took a soft microfiber cloth from my pocket and meticulously wiped down the brass casing, the marble surface, and the edges of the desk, erasing any trace of my fingerprints or physical presence. The office looked completely undisturbed. The expensive scotch bottles sat in silence. The leather chairs remained perfectly aligned. Derek would walk into this room in a few hours, completely oblivious to the fact that his father had turned his sanctuary into a live broadcasting station. I turned my back on the executive suite and slipped quietly back into the darkened hallway. I retraced my steps with calculated speed, moving down the central stairwell and back into the freezing concrete sub-basement. I pushed the heavy iron grate aside and crawled through the maintenance tunnel, emerging behind the rusted industrial dumpster. The freezing winter wind bit into my face as I walked quickly through the dark alleyways heading back to my vintage pickup truck. I climbed into the freezing cab and locked the heavy metal doors. My breathing was heavy, my muscles aching from the intense physical and emotional strain of the infiltration. But I could not rest. I reached into the glove compartment and pulled out the small black receiver unit Navarro had provided with the transmitter. I plugged a single molded earpiece into the jack and secured it firmly in my right ear. I flipped the power switch on the side of the receiver. The small digital screen glowed bright red, indicating a strong active connection. A soft crystal-clear hiss of static filled my ear. I reached over and tapped the volume dial. I could hear the faint, distant hum of the building's massive heating system filtering through the microphone. I could hear the subtle shifting of the ambient air pressure inside the corner office. The audio feed was absolutely flawless. I leaned back against the worn leather seat of my truck, staring through the frost-covered windshield at the towering glass headquarters across the street. The digital clock on my dashboard read 3:30 in the morning. I had the financial data. I had the live surveillance feed. The trap was set. Now, I sit in the freezing darkness and wait for them to speak. For 3 agonizing days, I lived entirely inside the cab of my vintage Ford pickup truck. I parked in the back corner of a busy coffee shop parking lot, completely blending in with the daily flow of morning commuters and delivery vans. The spot gave me a perfect unobstructed view of the Crawford commercial headquarters just down the street. The weather had turned brutally unforgiving. A relentless freezing sleet battered the windshield, layering the glass in a thick sheet of gray ice. I kept the engine running just enough to prevent the heater core from freezing over, surviving on bitter black coffee and stale protein bars. My entire existence had been violently reduced to the continuous soft hiss of static playing through the molded plastic earpiece secured firmly in my right ear. I was a phantom haunting the perimeter of my own stolen empire. The micro-audio transmitter I had meticulously wired into Derek's brass reading lamp functioned with terrifying perfection. The microphone was incredibly sensitive. I could hear the faint scratching of his expensive fountain pen against paper. I could hear the subtle shifting of his leather executive chair. I could hear every single mundane corporate conversation, every supply chain complaint, and every routine vendor negotiation. Listening to my son play the role of the visionary chief executive officer made my stomach churn with a sickening blend of profound sorrow and escalating rage. He sounded so incredibly confident, projecting the false authority of a self-made man, completely ignoring the fact that he was standing on the foundation of my lifetime of grueling labor. But I did not let my focus waver for a single second. Patience is the ultimate weapon of an experienced hunter. I knew they would eventually slip. I knew the silence would break. On the afternoon of the third day, the freezing sleet finally transitioned into a heavy, blinding snowstorm. The sky above Columbus darkened prematurely, casting a grim, oppressive shadow over the sprawling industrial district. The coffee shop parking lot began to empty out as people rushed home to escape the treacherous road conditions. I remained perfectly still in the driver's seat, my hands resting heavily on the cold steering wheel. I adjusted the volume dial on the black receiver unit resting on the passenger seat, amplifying the audio feed to block out the rhythmic thumping of the truck windshield wipers. Derek was wrapping up a phone call with a regional logistics manager, discussing delays in commercial freight shipping. His tone was dismissive and arrogant, lacking the fundamental respect required to manage a blue-collar workforce. I shook my head in the dark cabin of the truck. He fundamentally misunderstood the mechanics of respect. When the call finally disconnected, a brief, heavy silence settled over the executive corner office. Then I heard the unmistakable sound of the heavy wooden door swinging open. The biometric deadbolt clicked loudly, signaling an authorized entry. The sharp, rapid clicking of high heels echoed sharply across the imported marble floor. It was a distinctive, aggressive stride that I recognized instantly. Monica had arrived. The sudden shift in the atmosphere of the room was completely palpable, even through the tiny earpiece. Derek let out a long, heavy sigh, the manufactured corporate bravado immediately draining from his voice. Monica did not offer a greeting. She did not ask about his day. The clicking of her heels stopped directly in front of the marble desk. "Did the medical certificate completely clear through the county clerk yet?" Monica asked. Her voice was incredibly sharp, laced with a toxic, impatient anxiety that cut straight through the faint static of the transmission. "I swear to God, if there is a single delay in the judicial processing, I am going to lose my mind. That hack psychiatrist charged us $50,000 in untraceable cash just to backdate the evaluation paperwork. He guaranteed the expedited filing. If we do not have the certified judicial stamp by tomorrow morning, I am personally going to his private clinic and demanding a full refund." I sat frozen in the cab of my truck. The bitter cold, seeping through the floorboards, suddenly paled in comparison to the absolute ice flooding my veins. $50,000 in cash. A hack psychiatrist. Backdated evaluation paperwork. My mind raced rapidly, piecing together the horrifying fragments of their calculated conversation. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel, my knuckles turning completely white against the worn green leather. They had not just manipulated the legal system with a standard family trust. They had orchestrated a highly illegal, profoundly malicious medical conspiracy. They had literally purchased a fraudulent medical diagnosis from a corrupt physician to scientifically validate their fabricated claims of my mental incompetence. Derek let out a low, incredibly dark chuckle. It was a sound completely devoid of any human empathy or familial loyalty. It was the sound of pure, unadulterated greed securing a permanent victory. "Relax," Monica Derrick replied, his voice dripping with arrogant, overwhelming satisfaction. "You worry entirely too much." The cash payment completely secured his total cooperation. The doctor was incredibly thorough. He fabricated a comprehensive 3-year medical history detailing a rapid, aggressive cognitive decline. He falsified the clinical observation records, the mandatory memory test results, and the sworn neurological affidavits. The paperwork was absolutely bulletproof. I spoke directly with our lead litigation attorney 20 minutes ago. It is done. The presiding probate judge officially signed off on the Stage 2 Alzheimer's disease diagnosis this morning. The emergency hold has been permanently legally validated. The permanent conservatorship is officially ours. The words hit me like a devastating physical blow to the chest. Stage 2 Alzheimer's disease. The sheer, breathtaking malice of their strategy finally revealed itself in its absolute entirety. They had not just temporarily frozen my personal checking accounts to prevent me from writing charitable donations. They had successfully legally convinced the entire judicial system that my brain was fundamentally broken. They had submitted a completely fabricated, incredibly detailed medical history, proving that I possessed a rapidly deteriorating, incurable neurological disease. By purchasing that specific permanent diagnosis, they had effectively legally erased my mind. I stared blindly through the frost-covered windshield of my truck. The heavy snow continued to fall, burying the city in a thick layer of suffocating white. I was a completely healthy, highly functioning 70-year-old man who had built a massive corporate empire from absolute scratch. But in the eyes of the law, I was now officially a tragic, mindless shell of a human being, entirely dependent on the total mercy of a son who absolutely despised me. The sickening reality settled deeply into my bones. They were not merely stealing my life savings to fund their pathetic, superficial luxury lifestyle. They were intentionally terminating my sovereign legal existence. They had effectively buried me alive inside a permanent, unbreakable medical cage. Once they officially locked me inside an underfunded dementia ward, nobody would ever believe a single word I said. Any desperate plea for help would be dismissed as the tragic rambling of an old man. They bought a fake medical diagnosis to strip away my human rights. The permanent conservatorship was theirs. For 3 agonizing days, I lived entirely inside the cab of my vintage Ford pickup truck. I parked in the back corner of a busy coffee shop parking lot, completely blending in with the daily flow of morning commuters and delivery vans. The spot gave me a perfect, unobstructed view of the Crawford commercial headquarters just down the street. The heavy snow continued to fall, completely blanketing the windshield in a thick, suffocating layer of white ice. I sat perfectly still in the freezing darkness, my breathing shallow. The tiny black receiver unit resting on the passenger seat emitted a faint, continuous hum. Through the molded plastic earpiece, the live audio feed from my former executive office remained flawlessly crisp. The silence in the corner office suddenly broke, and the conversation rapidly descended into a level of absolute darkness that made my blood run entirely cold. I heard the heavy rhythmic thud of the heavy wooden door swinging open. The sharp, rapid clicking of high heels echoed aggressively across the imported marble floor. Monica walked in. Her voice was incredibly sharp, laced with a toxic, impatient anxiety that cut straight through the faint static of the transmission. "Did the medical certificate clear?" she demanded. "That hack psychiatrist charged us $50,000 cash to backdate the paperwork. I swear to God, if there is a single delay in the judicial processing, I am going to lose my mind." I sat frozen in the cab of my truck. The bitter cold seeping through the floorboards suddenly paled in comparison to the absolute ice flooding my veins. $50,000 in cash. A hack psychiatrist. Backdated evaluation paperwork. My mind raced rapidly, piecing together the horrifying fragments of their calculated conversation. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel, my knuckles turning completely white against the worn green leather. They had successfully orchestrated a highly illegal, profoundly malicious secret medical conspiracy. Derek let out a low, incredibly dark chuckle. It was a sound completely devoid of any human empathy or familial loyalty. "It is done," Derek replied, his voice dripping with arrogant, overwhelming satisfaction. "The court officially signed off on the Stage 2 Alzheimer's disease diagnosis. The permanent conservatorship is ours." The words hit me like a devastating physical blow to the chest. Stage 2 Alzheimer's disease. The sheer, breathtaking malice of their strategy finally revealed itself in its absolute entirety. They had not just temporarily frozen my personal checking accounts to prevent me from writing charitable donations. They had successfully legally convinced the entire judicial system that my brain was fundamentally broken. They had submitted a completely fabricated, incredibly detailed medical history, proving that I possessed a rapidly deteriorating, incurable neurological disease. By purposefully purchasing that highly specific, permanent fake diagnosis, they had effectively legally erased my entire mind. The pacing footsteps suddenly stopped abruptly. I heard the faint clinking of crystal glass against marble. Derek was casually pouring himself another expensive drink, celebrating his magnificent impending victory over the man who had given him everything. "The final logistical phase is completely mapped out and firmly secured," Derek said. "The ambulance is officially scheduled for next Friday at 9 in the morning. They will pick the old man up and take him directly to the lockdown dementia ward at Shady Pines." Shady Pines. The mere utterance of that specific facility name sent a violently cold tremor straight down my spine. It was a notoriously grim, severely underfunded state facility located deep in the forgotten industrial edge of the neighboring county. It was an overcrowded, profoundly bleak concrete fortress, deliberately designed exclusively for the completely forgotten and the desperately destitute. It was a terrible place where severely incapacitated wards of the state were heavily medicated and locked away behind reinforced steel doors and frosted safety glass. Through the earpiece, I heard Monica let out a sharp, genuine laugh. It was a vicious, glittering sound that echoed around the cavernous executive suite. Shady Pines. Monica repeated, her voice dripping with profound amusement and absolute malice. "That is absolutely brilliant, my Derek. Once he is securely locked in the memory ward, nobody will believe a word he says. If he tries to report us for corporate embezzlement, the underpaid nursing staff will simply sedate him and document it as a severe paranoid delusion. He will be entirely neutralized. The physical extraction on Friday morning is merely the final operational cleanup," Derek stated smoothly. "We wire the $12 million in cash to the hidden Cayman accounts on Thursday night and file for corporate bankruptcy on Monday. The entire commercial entity will instantly collapse under the massive weight of the highly leveraged offshore margin debt. We will publicly claim that the old man severely mismanaged the corporate supply chain during his rapid cognitive decline." I squeezed my two eyes tightly shut against the blinding panic. The sheer, breathtaking cruelty of their meticulous strategy was almost entirely impossible to fully comprehend. They were entirely weaponizing the horrific reality of severe cognitive decline to execute an absolutely flawless financial execution. They were maliciously going to chemically straitjacket my mind and permanently bury my voice under layers of heavy state bureaucracy. If I aggressively fought back during the physical extraction next Friday, if I yelled and loudly demanded a lawyer, it would only serve to legally validate the fraudulent medical narrative. The transport team would strictly view my righteous anger as aggressive dementia-induced hostility. I would be violently physically restrained, tightly strapped to a medical gurney, and forcibly injected with heavy sedatives before I even reached the bleak concrete walls of the state asylum. I reached up with a freezing, trembling hand and slowly pulled the molded plastic earpiece out of my right ear. The faint, hissing static was instantly replaced by the loud, howling, bitter winter wind aggressively battering the frosted exterior metal panels of my truck. The chilling reality of their impending devastating timeline was officially completely set. Next Friday, at exactly 9 in the morning, the heavily guarded private ambulance would arrive directly at my front door, to strip away my basic human rights and permanently lock me away in a heavily fortified state asylum. On Thursday night, they would ruthlessly wire $12 million to the untraceable Cayman Islands. On Monday morning, they would completely obliterate the $40 million corporate empire I had relentlessly sacrificed my entire adult life to meticulously construct. They had formulated a perfectly synchronized, utterly flawless, deeply evil plan to thoroughly steal my vast wealth, entirely destroy my proud legacy, and completely erase my human existence. But they had confidently made one absolutely catastrophic, undeniably fatal miscalculation. They firmly believed I was currently lying fast asleep in my stolen house, blissfully unaware of the sharp guillotine swinging rapidly toward my exposed neck. They did not yet truly know I had the military-grade encrypted hard drive resting heavily in my coat pocket. They did not know I had recorded every single damning syllable of their horrific conspiracy. I turned the ignition key, and the heavy engine roared aggressively to life. I jammed the heavy transmission forcefully into drive. The long time for my silent observation was officially over. I pulled away from the curb, my heavy tires crushing the fresh layer of snow that covered the dark pavement. The blizzard was intensifying, but the treacherous road conditions meant absolutely nothing to me now. My mind was sharp-focused entirely on the devastating timeline ticking down in my head. I did not return to the cheap motel. I drove straight through the howling storm toward the affluent suburbs of Dublin, heading directly for Rick Dalton's private residence. It was 4 a.m. when I pulled into his winding, tree-lined driveway. I walked up to the heavy oak front door and pounded my frozen fist against the wood until the porch lights finally flickered on. Rick answered the door, wearing a thick robe, his eyes narrowed in sleep. But the moment he saw the absolute dead-cold look on my face, he did not ask a single question. He simply stepped aside and ushered me into his warm, dimly lit home office. I sat down heavily in a leather wingback chair. I pulled the military-grade encrypted hard drive from my winter coat and set it on his mahogany desk. Then I unclipped the black audio receiver from my belt, placed it next to the drive, and hit the playback button. Rick stood perfectly still, his arms crossed over his chest, as the crystal-clear recording filled the quiet room. He listened to Monica complaining about paying a corrupt psychiatrist $50,000 in cash. He listened to Derek proudly confirming the stage 2 Alzheimer's disease diagnosis. He listened as my own son calmly detailed his plan to have me dragged out of my home on Friday morning by an ambulance crew and permanently locked inside the dementia ward at Shady Pines. He listened to them calculate the exact hour they would wire $12 million to the Cayman Islands and file for corporate bankruptcy. When the recording finally clicked off, the silence in the room was suffocating. Rick slowly walked over to his desk, picked up the encrypted hard drive, and plugged it into his secure forensic computer. He did not offer me any empty platitudes or useless words of comfort. He knew I did not need sympathy. I needed a war plan. Rick launched a series of complex data decryption tools, his eyes scanning the raw financial ledgers I had pulled from the subterranean corporate mainframe. For nearly an hour, the only sounds in the office were the howling wind outside the window and the rapid clicking of Rick's keyboard. He was meticulously tracing the origin points of the massive offshore margin accounts Derek had established. He followed the digital trail of the 6 fabricated shell companies, cross-referencing their outgoing wire transfers with international banking registries. Suddenly, Rick stopped typing. He leaned close to the monitor, reading a deeply buried sequence of transactional codes. He pulled off his reading glasses and rubbed his eyes with a profound, heavy exhaustion. William, Rick said, his voice entirely devoid of its usual aggressive confidence. The situation is drastically worse than simple corporate embezzlement. Derek has not merely been siphoning your operating capital to fund a lavish lifestyle. He has been systematically liquidating your entire corporate infrastructure to cover catastrophic, incredibly reckless investment losses. I looked at him, demanding absolute clarity. Rick turned the monitor toward me. He opened a hidden directory linking the offshore margin accounts to a highly unregulated black market cryptocurrency exchange based out of Eastern Europe. Derek had been aggressively day trading volatile digital assets, using extreme illegal institutional leverage. He had used the pristine credit rating of Crawford Commercial, HVAC, to borrow tens of millions of dollars from shadow lenders, pouring every single cent into highly speculative crypto markets. The digital ledgers painted a horrifying picture of a desperate man chasing his own ruin. Derek had completely lost a staggering $20 million over the past 8 months. The massive margin calls were coming due, and the offshore lenders were aggressively demanding their money. Derek had completely exhausted the corporate cash reserves. He had leveraged the warehouses, the service trucks, and the heavy machinery to the absolute maximum legal limit. The $12 million they were planning to wire to the Cayman Islands on Thursday night was not a strategic corporate maneuver. It was the absolute last remaining scrap of liquid cash your company possessed. It was their untraceable getaway fund. They were completely draining the final drops of blood from the empire, preparing to abandon the dry husk of the corporation before the massive margin debt triggered a catastrophic default. I stared blindly at the glowing monitor, struggling to process the sheer magnitude of his absolute failure. My son was not a criminal mastermind. He was a pathetic, terrified gambler who had completely decimated a $40 million commercial enterprise to cover his own spectacular incompetence. He had destroyed my life's work simply because he was too arrogant to admit he was losing. But the financial devastation was only a fraction of the true horror. Rick stood up from his leather chair and began pacing across the woven rug, his brilliant legal mind racing to connect the final deadliest dots of this malicious conspiracy. He stopped pacing and looked directly at me with a grim, terrifying realization settling heavily over his features. "William, you need to understand the absolute gravity of the federal landscape right now," Rick said, his voice dropping to a harsh, urgent whisper. "The Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Securities and Exchange Commission are actively investigating these specific offshore crypto platforms for massive institutional money laundering and severe wire fraud. The federal task forces are currently tracking the exact digital transaction routes Derek has been utilizing. It is only a matter of time before the federal authorities trace the origin of those illegal margin accounts directly back to the physical servers at Crawford Commercial." The ultimate malice of their Friday morning timeline suddenly crystallized in my mind with blinding, horrific clarity. Derek was not just stealing my last $12 million. He was intentionally framing me for one of the largest corporate wire fraud cases in the history of the state. Rick placed his hands firmly on the heavy mahogany desk, leaning in incredibly close to my face. "Do you clearly see the entire board now, William?" he asked grimly. "On Thursday night, they will directly wire the $12 million to the Cayman Islands and instantly vanish without a single trace. On Friday morning, you are forcibly heavily sedated and permanently locked inside the dementia ward at Shady Pines. On Monday, the massive corporate bankruptcy inevitably triggers the catastrophic default. When the federal agents finally raid the corporate headquarters, Derek and Monica will already be long gone. Your forged signature is printed on every single illegal offshore transfer document. You will be the sole corporate owner on paper, securely locked inside an underfunded state asylum, completely legally incapacitated. They will purposefully leave you behind to take the entire absolute fall for massive federal wire fraud. They were not just simply stealing my hard-earned money anymore. They were permanently and completely burying me alive in a concrete cage." I stared across the mahogany desk at Rick Dalton, letting the terrifying magnitude of his revelation wash over me. Derek engineered the ultimate scapegoat scenario. He utilized my life's work to gamble in volatile sectors of the global digital economy. He lost $20 million on illegal margin trades, decimating Crawford Commercial. Now he planned to abscond with the $12 million, leaving me trapped in a psychiatric ward to absorb the federal fallout. The federal task forces were already circling. When those offshore exchanges collapsed, authorities would trace the wire fraud directly to my forged signature. I would spend my final days inside a federal penitentiary, unable to articulate my defense. We need to contact the Federal Bureau of Investigation immediately. Rick said, his voice laced with intensity. We must present this hard drive to the attorney before Derek initiates the final wire transfer. If we move now, we can secure a federal injunction and freeze every corporate account. I shook my head, feeling a cold focus overriding the panic. We cannot go to the federal authorities yet. Rick, I replied, my voice steady. If the federal government intervenes and freezes the corporate assets, now that remaining $12 million will be trapped in a judicial limbo for the next decade. The government will seize the operational accounts as evidence in a wire fraud investigation. The company will instantly default on payroll. My employees will lose their jobs, health insurance, and livelihoods by Friday afternoon. The commercial empire I built from scratch will bleed out and die on a federal autopsy table. I cannot allow my workforce to suffer for my son's greed. I must secure that money before the authorities even know it exists. Rick leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. He looked at me with skepticism. William, he countered smoothly. Derek holds the legal authority of the chief executive officer. He has fortified his position with a conservatorship declaring you mentally incompetent. You do not possess the legal authority to move a penny of that remaining $12 million. Any aggressive attempt to intercept that wire transfer will trigger internal banking alarms, and the fraud department will defer to the legally recognized chief executive officer. Derek holds all the administrative keys. I let out a breath and leaned forward, resting my forearms on the mahogany. Derek holds the administrative keys, I stated quietly, looking into his eyes. But he does not hold the foundational keys. He believes corporate power is derived entirely from his current executive title. He forgot who authored the original corporate bylaws 28 years ago. I need you to pull up the original corporate charter we drafted when Crawford Commercial first incorporated. I need you to navigate directly to Section 7, Paragraph 4. Rick frowned, confused by my directive. He turned back to his computer, fingers flying across the keyboard as he accessed the archived foundational documents of my company. He opened the original charter from 3 decades ago and scrolled rapidly down the screen. His eyes scanned the legal text. Suddenly, his rapid scrolling stopped. A sharp gasp escaped his lips. He took off his glasses, staring at the monitor in shock. The poison pill. Rick whispered, his voice trembling with realization. I completely forgot we embedded this mechanism into the foundational framework. When I established this company, I was a cautious man who mistrusted the corporate world. I wanted an ironclad guarantee that no rogue executive could dismantle the empire. I instructed Rick to weave an obscure clause into the foundational DNA of the corporation. It was the ultimate fail-safe. The clause stated that if the sitting chief executive officer was defrauding the corporate entity, the founder retained the unilateral legal right to revoke all executive powers and seize total control of all liquid assets without requiring a board vote. It bypassed every corporate governance protocol. It was a legal guillotine designed to sever a rogue executive's head. But William, Rick stammered frantically, adjusting his glasses. This clause requires undeniable proof of corporate fraud to trigger the executive override. You cannot activate this mechanism based on suspicion. If you trigger this without absolute proof, the banking institutions will heavily penalize the corporation and freeze the transfer. I tapped my index finger firmly against the encrypted hard drive. I have the entire shadow ledger detailing $4 million in corporate embezzlement, I replied. I have the illegal offshore margin account documentation proving he collateralized the physical corporate infrastructure without board approval. I have a crystal-clear audio recording of him admitting to purchasing a fraudulent medical diagnosis to forcefully strip away my human rights. I do not just have irrefutable proof, Rick. I have an absolute avalanche of incriminating evidence. I need you to immediately draft the formal declaration of executive revocation. I need you to strictly format the legal execution of the poison pill protocol. For 48 hours, Rick and I worked in unrelenting secrecy inside his isolated home office. We meticulously prepared the legal documentation, cross-referencing every fraudulent digital transaction against the specific parameters of the poison pill clause. We prepared a massive encrypted digital packet containing the undeniable proof of Derek's offshore wire fraud, his illegal corporate embezzlement, and the audio recording of the Shady Pines medical conspiracy. We carefully mapped out the exact digital routing numbers for a secure secondary holding account that Derek had no knowledge of. We were completely arming the explosive mechanism of his ultimate financial destruction. I barely slept. I barely ate. I survived entirely on black coffee and the raw adrenaline of a desperate father fighting for his survival. The agonizing hours slowly ticked by, entirely consumed by complex legal maneuvering and aggressive digital preparation. The bitter winter storm outside finally broke, giving way to a freezing, bleak gray sky. Finally, the highly anticipated Thursday night arrived. The heavy darkness settled over the quiet suburban neighborhood, bringing with it a suffocating, almost unbearable tension. Early tomorrow morning, at exactly 9 o'clock, Derek's armed medical team would arrive at my front door with a fake psychiatric warrant and a powerful sedative. They fully intended to forcefully drag me out of my stolen home and permanently lock me inside a forgotten dementia ward. Tonight, at exactly midnight, Derek planned to drain the remaining $12 million from the corporate accounts and quietly wire the massive fortune to his untraceable Cayman Islands safe haven, leaving me to face the catastrophic fury of the federal government. I sit silently in the dim light of Rick's home office, staring intensely at the glowing screen of my heavily encrypted laptop. The digital clock in the bottom corner of the monitor reads 11:55. 5 minutes until Derek initiates the massive offshore wire transfer. 5 minutes until he attempts to execute the final devastating phase of his incredibly evil plan. Rick stands completely still behind me, his breathing shallow, his hands resting heavily on the back of my leather chair. The complex execution protocols are fully loaded. The massive evidence packets are heavily encrypted and perfectly primed for immediate automated distribution. I rest my fingers gently on the keyboard. It is time for the execution. I press the command key instantly, breathing life into the heavy, complicated decryption software we had meticulously compiled over the last 48 hours. The digital clock glowing in the bottom right corner of the monitor shifted to 11:56. The freezing winter wind continued to howl aggressively against the thick glass of Rick Dalton's suburban home office window, but the interior of the room was completely suffocated by an incredibly tense, heavy silence. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the tremendous weight of the past 30 years settling firmly onto my shoulders. I was about to aggressively dismantle the exact corporate empire I had relentlessly sacrificed my entire adult life to construct. But I was not destroying it out of malice. I was performing a drastic, necessary amputation to safely preserve the final remaining heartbeat of Crawford Commercial. Rick remained standing perfectly still behind my leather chair, his presence a silent, steadfast pillar of legal validation. He had painstakingly drafted the ironclad foundational clauses nearly 3 decades ago. He fundamentally knew the absolute uncompromising legal power of the incredibly legendary poison pill because he personally designed it to be entirely unstoppable. The screen flashed a brilliant stark white before transitioning into the raw, unfiltered command terminal of the primary corporate banking portal. Derek had spent an absolute fortune installing state-of-the-art cybersecurity measures, relying heavily on modern cloud-based biometric tokens and multi-factor digital authentication protocols. He genuinely believed those expensive, shiny digital padlocks made him an untouchable corporate king. But he fundamentally misunderstood the absolute architecture of the system he was trying to hijack. The poison pill protocol did not attempt to politely knock on the front door of his fancy new firewalls. It bypassed the entire modern network entirely utilizing the original hardwired root access codes I had physically embedded into the foundational servers 20 years ago. The master override command sliced through his expensive digital security tokens like a razor-sharp scalpel through thin paper. A harsh green prompt blinked rapidly on the dark monitor, requesting the ultimate biometric authorization sequence. I leaned forward, plugging a small portable fingerprint scanner directly into the USB port of my laptop. I pressed my right thumb firmly against the glowing glass sensor. The machine hummed quietly, verifying my biological identity against the deeply buried foundational corporate registry. A sudden satisfying electronic chime echoed from the laptop speakers. The digital terminal instantly bypassed the final security gateway. I was fully embedded inside the central international wire system of the Crawford Commercial Financial Network. I possessed absolute, unilateral, unregulated control over every single liquid asset tied to the corporate entity. No board approval was required. No secondary executive signatures were needed. The poison pill had officially granted me the absolute power of a corporate dictator, entirely overriding the fraudulent authority of the sitting chief executive officer. I swiftly navigated through the complex maze of internal corporate ledgers, bypassing the standard operational accounts and diving straight into the restricted international holding directories. The financial damage Derek had recklessly inflicted upon the company was starkly illuminated across the glowing screen. The primary operating accounts were completely decimated, drained dry by the relentless parasitic siphoning of his fabricated shell companies. The massive offshore margin debt loomed like a dark, catastrophic shadow over the remaining capital infrastructure. I filtered the active transaction queues, specifically targeting the outgoing international wire transfers. The search query loaded for a brief, agonizing second before a massive, glaring red line item populated directly in the very center of my screen. There it was. A staggering $12,400,000 was sitting quietly in a temporary, heavily encrypted corporate holding account. The massive sum represented the absolute last remaining drops of liquid lifeblood flowing through the veins of Crawford Commercial. It was the money I had earned through 3 decades of grueling, relentless labor, sweating in freezing warehouses, and negotiating brutal commercial contracts. Derek had meticulously cued the massive transfer to automatically initiate at exactly 8 o'clock on Friday morning. The final destination routing number was tied directly to a highly secure, entirely untraceable private banking institution located deep within the Cayman Islands. The sickening, undeniable reality of his timeline hit me with the physical force of a sledgehammer. At 8 o'clock, the $12.4 million would vanish completely into the Caribbean banking system. 1 hour later, at exactly 9 o'clock, the private medical transport team would violently kick down my front door, inject me with heavy chemical sedatives, and drag me away to the Shady Pines dementia ward. It was a flawlessly synchronized, completely merciless execution strategy. I felt a cold, calculated fury radiating outward from my chest, steadying my hands and sharpening my absolute focus. Derek thought he had successfully cornered a helpless, obsolete old man. He thought I was going to passively fade away into a medicated oblivion while he selfishly lived out his pathetic, unearned billionaire fantasy on a tropical beach. I moved my cursor directly over the massive pending $12.4 million wire transfer. I did not feel a single ounce of paternal hesitation. I did not feel a shred of tragic remorse. I simply clicked the execution prompt. A secondary warning box popped up on the monitor, demanding administrative confirmation to permanently cancel the scheduled international transition. I typed in my unique alphanumeric founder identification code and struck the enter key with deliberate, absolute finality. The glowing red line item instantly evaporated from the active queue. The $12.4 million was immediately ripped entirely out of Derek's greedy, desperate grasp and securely locked back inside the protected foundational corporate vault. The getaway vehicle had just been completely dismantled, but simply stopping the theft was no longer sufficient. I needed to fundamentally ensure that Derek and Monica could never attempt to mount a secondary financial attack against me. I needed to completely financially paralyze them before the sun rose. I navigated back to the primary directory, scanning the deeply buried architecture of the corporate accounts. Derek had been sloppy in his desperate rush to steal everything. He and Monica had established a highly secure, joint personal banking account to store their previously embezzled consulting fees and finance their lavish lifestyle. But in order to easily facilitate the continuous flow of stolen corporate funds, they had technically structured their private banking portal as a direct dependent subaccount of the primary Crawford commercial financial umbrella. They foolishly believed that controlling the chief executive position shielded them from any internal administrative scrutiny. They forgot that the poison pill protocol granted the founder unrestricted unilateral access to every subsidiary account tethered to the corporate tax identification number. I bypassed the secondary firewalls separating their personal finances from the business network. I linked directly into the heart of their exclusive joint account. The digital ledger populated on my screen, displaying a massive unearned personal balance built entirely on a foundation of my stolen labor, relentless deceit, and elder abuse. I stared at the numbers, feeling the cold, satisfying weight of justice resting at my fingertips. I highlighted the entire directory. I targeted every penny they had hoarded. The balance staring back at me from their exclusive joint personal account was a staggering $800,000. I paused for a moment, simply absorbing the sheer audacity of that specific number. This massive sum was not money earned through late nights at the corporate office or strategic business negotiations. This was the accumulated blood money they had methodically siphoned from the primary operating budget over the past 3 years. They had deceitfully disguised these massive personal withdrawals as legitimate vendor payments and executive consulting fees, hiding their superficial lifestyle upgrades under the dense bureaucratic umbrella of Crawford Commercial. They had purchased imported luxury vehicles, designer wardrobes, and extravagant European vacations, using the very foundation of my legacy. This specific $800,000 was the liquid reserve meant to directly fund their luxurious tropical getaway while I rotted away in a state-funded psychiatric ward. I felt a sudden surge of cold, entirely righteous anger radiating through my chest. I was not just going to intercept their illicit Cayman Islands wire transfer. I was going to surgically excise every single asset they possessed, to guarantee they could never legally touch this money again. Rick and I had spent the previous afternoon meticulously constructing a completely impenetrable financial fortress. We did not merely open another standard corporate holding account at a local branch. We established a highly complex, bulletproof, irrevocable trust permanently located within the state of South Dakota. We deliberately chose that highly specific jurisdiction because its unique asset protection laws are globally recognized as absolutely ironclad. Once the funds crossed into the strict legal boundaries of that specific trust, they would instantly become entirely legally untouchable. The massive capital reserve would be permanently shielded from any future corporate bankruptcy proceedings, fully protected from aggressive federal asset forfeiture, resulting from Derek's reckless offshore wire fraud, and completely insulated from any desperate legal challenges my son might attempt to mount in probate court. The impenetrable legal fortress was absolutely perfect in every single structural detail. I was completely ready. I shifted my unwavering attention back to the glowing screen of the laptop. The faint, steady hum of the internal processor blended seamlessly with the rhythmic sound of my own breathing. The sophisticated digital interface of the master banking portal waited patiently for my absolute command. I initiated the first critical step of the aggressive termination sequence. I carefully typed in the incredibly complex, heavily encrypted alphanumeric routing numbers corresponding to the newly formed South Dakota Trust. I double-checked the intricate series of verification digits, ensuring the mathematical sequence was absolutely flawless before proceeding any further. I rested my hand on the smooth plastic of the peripheral mouse. I firmly pressed the primary button, executing the first click. The highly secure network connection was instantly established, creating a protected digital pipeline directly between the compromised Crawford commercial servers and the impenetrable legal fortress out west. The banking system prompted me to securely consolidate the targeted funds. I digitally merged the massive $12,400,000 I had just intercepted from the pending Cayman Islands transfer with the $800,000 sitting comfortably in Derek and Monica's personal checking account. The newly combined total populated in bold, glowing green text directly in the center of the dark monitor. $13,200,000. This massive figure represented the absolute entirety of my life's hard work. It was the physical, liquid manifestation of 3 decades of endless personal sacrifice, of tirelessly building a powerful commercial empire from absolute scratch, of aggressively providing a pristine, privileged life for a son who ultimately viewed me as nothing more than disposable collateral. I hovered the digital cursor precisely over the final automated authorization prompt. I paused for a fraction of a second, letting the profound gravity of the moment settle deeply into my bones. I closed my eyes and allowed myself to feel the immense weight of the betrayal that had completely shattered my family. I thought about the fake Alzheimer diagnosis they had so casually purchased. I thought about the corrupt, hack psychiatrist they had gleefully bribed to validate their malicious lies. I thought about the heavily guarded private ambulance they had eagerly scheduled to violently rip me away from my home in exactly 9 hours. I pressed the mouse button, executing the second click. I officially authorized the massive consolidated financial transfer. The corporate banking system froze for a long, agonizing second, digitally validating the biometric override and officially confirming the unprecedented financial maneuver. A final glaring dialog box suddenly appeared in the dead center of the screen, demanding the ultimate administrative confirmation. It warned me that this specific transfer was irreversible and would permanently bypass all standard corporate delay protocols. There was absolutely no hesitation remaining in my mind, no lingering paternal weakness to stay my hand. I pushed down on the mouse button for the third and final time. Click number 3. The decisive execution was completely locked in. I sat back heavily in the leather wingback chair, letting out a long, slow breath as I watched the horizontal progress bar rapidly fill with bright green light. The secure banking server successfully verified the complex digital handshake. The heavily encrypted financial pipeline seamlessly sealed itself behind the massive movement of capital. Then the screen flashed brightly with a simple, beautifully definitive message. Transfer successful. The South Dakota Irrevocable Trust was instantly, legally locked down. The entire massive fortune was now strictly managed by an aggressive, entirely independent third-party law firm. The vast funds were permanently legally inaccessible to Derek under any conceivable circumstances, strictly reserved only for legitimate philanthropic charitable organizations and future innocent descendants. He could never touch a single dime. I leaned forward and navigated back to the primary corporate banking directory for one final crucial verification. I wanted to see the absolute devastation for myself. I navigated through the administrative menus and pulled up the active financial dashboard for Derek and Monica's exclusive joint personal account. I hovered the cursor over the browser navigation controls and hit the refresh key. The banking page reloaded almost instantly over the secure connection. The previous balance of $800,000 was gone, completely wiped from the digital ledger, as if it had never existed. The glowing digital numbers staring back at me on the high-resolution monitor read $0.00. A profound, heavy silence filled the dark room as the finality of my execution washed over me. They were completely, irrevocably ruined. Tomorrow morning, when the heavily armed federal agents finally breached the corporate headquarters, Derek would realize his Cayman getaway fund was utterly vaporized. He would try to access his private accounts to fund a desperate legal defense only to discover absolute nothingness. They had meticulously dug a perfectly calculated, inescapable financial grave intended entirely for me, and with 3 simple clicks, I had effectively shoved them directly into it. The massive, inescapable trap was finally sprung. They had aggressively manufactured their own tragic demise and I was simply delivering the final definitive stroke of absolute corporate justice. The sick, twisted game they decided to aggressively play was entirely over. The financial destruction was complete, but simply erasing their stolen wealth was not enough to balance the scales of justice. Taking their money neutralized their escape, but did not address the fundamental evil of their actions. They crossed a line demanding a much harsher penalty. They aggressively weaponized the medical establishment and legal system to strip away my basic human rights. They coldly planned to imprison me inside an underfunded psychiatric facility, effectively burying me alive so they could steal my life's work without consequence. A simple financial ruin was too merciful for that level of malicious calculation. They needed to face the crushing weight of the law they had so arrogantly sought to manipulate. I turned my attention away from the zeroed-out banking portal and opened a separate, highly secure digital directory located directly on my encrypted desktop. This specific directory contained the gathered arsenal of their absolute downfall. I compiled the extensive digital dossier, ensuring every piece of evidence was perfectly organized for a federal prosecutor to digest. First, I uploaded the horrifying medical documentation. I included the fraudulent Stage 2 Alzheimer's disease diagnosis, complete with the falsified clinical observation records and memory test results they submitted to the probate court. I attached the incriminating digital accounting trails definitively tracing the $50,000 cash bribe directly from their joint personal account to the private offshore shell of the corrupt psychiatrist. The financial footprint of their conspiracy was clear, painting a devastating picture of premeditated elder abuse and systemic judicial fraud. Second, I integrated the crystal-clear audio recordings into the primary evidence folder. I uploaded the pristine transmission captured while sitting in the freezing cab of my vintage Ford pickup truck in the back corner of the coffee shop parking lot. The recording perfectly captured every single damning syllable of their dark corporate conversation. The file preserved Derek proudly boasting about securing the permanent conservatorship through bribery and deceit. It captured Monica sharply, complaining about the agonizing delays in judicial processing. Most importantly, the audio securely documented their exact plan to utilize a heavily guarded private ambulance to extract me from my home on Friday morning and permanently lock me inside the dementia ward at Shady Pines. Hearing their vicious laughter echo through the small speakers of my laptop only hardened my absolute resolve. I meticulously time-stamped the audio files, providing a clear timeline of their aggressive, premeditated conspiracy. Third, I uploaded the massive, catastrophic offshore financial ledgers. Rick had done an extraordinary job decrypting and organizing the raw data pulled from the subterranean corporate mainframe. I attached the digital spreadsheets detailing Derek's desperate, incredibly reckless investment losses. The files clearly showed how he utilized the pristine credit rating of Crawford Commercial to illegally secure tens of millions in highly leveraged institutional loans. The ledgers provided undeniable proof of his disastrous foray into unregulated cryptocurrency exchanges based out of Eastern Europe. The data explicitly tracked the $20 million he completely vaporized in highly volatile digital assets over the past 8 months. Furthermore, I included the urgent margin call notices from the shadow lenders proving his absolute desperation. Finally, I attached the definitive banking logs showcasing his ultimate, failed attempt to silently wire the remaining $12,400,000 directly to the untraceable Cayman Islands safe haven. I merged these discrete, highly incriminating components into a single, utterly devastating digital dossier. Every file was meticulously labeled, heavily cross-referenced, and undeniably authenticated by the original corporate servers. With the massive evidence packet fully compiled, I needed to establish a perfectly secure method of delivery. I could not send this explosive information from a standard, easily traceable corporate email address. I needed an utterly anonymous, perfectly secure digital conduit to ensure my physical safety while authorities mobilized. I initiated a highly encrypted, decentralized virtual private network routing my digital signature through dozens of international proxy servers located in various secure jurisdictions across the globe. This complex routing protocol ensured absolute anonymity, masking my physical location inside Rick's dimly lit home office. Once the secure network connection was firmly established, I accessed a specialized email client specifically designed to protect high-level corporate and federal whistleblowers. The interface was stark dark and highly functional, stripped of identifying metadata or tracking software. I carefully typed in the outgoing recipient addresses. I targeted the primary investigative tip lines for the highest echelons of federal law enforcement. In the primary recipient field, I entered the direct contact address for the Federal Bureau of Investigation, specifically routing the dossier to the white-collar crime division. In the secondary recipient field, I entered the contact address for the Criminal Investigation Unit of the Internal Revenue Service, knowing they would aggressively pursue the massive undeclared offshore wealth and the blatant tax evasion associated with Derek's hidden Cayman Islands accounts. I filled out the subject line with a cold, objective, and highly descriptive title, ensuring it would instantly trigger their automated high-priority sorting algorithms. Massive corporate embezzlement, wire fraud, and illegal cryptocurrency leveraging at Crawford Commercial. I attached the massive encrypted digital dossier to the outgoing message. I watched the progress bar slowly fill as the gigabytes of incriminating evidence uploaded to the secure federal servers. I reviewed the short, concise summary I had written in the body of the email. I provided the exact names, corporate titles, and home addresses of both Derek and Monica. I outlined the specific nature of the $20 million cryptocurrency fraud and the malicious $50,000 medical bribery scheme. I detailed the exact offshore routing numbers they had utilized to hide their stolen wealth. I stated clearly that the sitting chief executive officer had actively defrauded the corporate entity and was currently attempting to flee the country with stolen capital. I did not include my own name. I simply signed off as a concerned corporate whistleblower. The upload finally completed with a soft, definitive chime. The massive digital bomb was fully primed and locked onto its designated targets. Tomorrow morning at exactly 9 o'clock, the fake ambulance crew was still scheduled to arrive at my front door with a fraudulent psychiatric warrant and a powerful sedative. They still fully expected to find a helpless, terrified old man completely ready to be dragged away into permanent obscurity. But the landscape of the war had completely shifted while they slept. By the time that heavy wooden door swung open tomorrow, the federal gears would already be grinding them into absolute dust. I sat back in the leather wingback chair, my eyes locked on the glowing blue send button resting in the center of the dark monitor. The freezing winter wind continued to violently batter the thick glass of the office window, but I felt nothing but a profound, absolute calm radiating through my entire body. I moved my right hand, resting my fingers gently on the smooth plastic of the peripheral mouse. I positioned the digital cursor directly over the final execution command. I pressed down firmly. I hit send. The screen instantly refreshed, displaying a simple bright green confirmation message. Message delivered. The massive, inescapable federal trap had officially slammed shut on their necks. I sat in the dim glow of Rick Dalton's office long after the confirmation message appeared. The digital trap was set. I closed the laptop, the soft click mirroring the finality of my decision. The winter storm had exhausted itself, leaving a freezing silence wrapped around the neighborhood. I thanked Rick for his unwavering loyalty. He nodded, shaking my hand, with a firm understanding of the monumental shift that had occurred. I walked out his front door and stepped into the bitter cold. The air was crisp and still cleansed by the violent blizzard. I climbed back into the cab of my pickup truck and turned the ignition. The engine rumbled to life, a comforting sound in the dead of winter. The time for silent observation was over. I drove slowly through the empty streets of Columbus, heading directly back to the sprawling estate Derek and Monica had stolen from me. It was exactly 6 in the morning when I pulled into the sweeping driveway of my own home. The massive stone house was dark, silent, and imposing against the gray twilight of the breaking dawn. Derek and Monica were undoubtedly still upstairs in the master suite, sleeping the deep sleep of the incredibly greedy. They believed this Friday morning would mark the triumphant culmination of their corporate coup. They firmly believed that in just 3 short hours, a medical transport team would forcefully drag me out of my bedroom and lock me away in a state-funded dementia ward. I unlocked the heavy oak front door and stepped into the grand foyer, my boots making no sound against the imported marble floor. I moved through the dark, familiar hallways with calculated precision. I did not feel a single trace of nostalgia as I walked past the expensive artwork. This structure was no longer my home. It was merely a crime scene waiting for the federal authorities. I walked silently up the back staircase and entered my bedroom. I pulled a faded canvas duffel bag from the closet shelf. I systematically gathered a few changes of durable clothing, my heavy winter boots, my essential documents, and my shaving kit. I left behind the tailored suits, the silk ties, and the gold watches. Those items belonged to an executive who no longer existed. I zipped the canvas bag shut, feeling a profound sense of emotional liberation. I was leaving the suffocating weight of their toxic deception entirely behind me. I carried the duffel bag downstairs and walked directly into the pristine custom kitchen. The vast marble island in the center of the room was completely clear-wiped, flawlessly clean by the housekeeping staff. It provided the perfect canvas for the devastating psychological blow I was about to deliver. I unzipped the front pocket of my duffel bag and pulled out the physical copies of the damning documents. I arranged them on the cold marble surface with deliberate geometric precision. First, I placed the fraudulent medical file directly in the center. The bold printed words, Stage 2 Alzheimer's disease diagnosis, stared back at me, a sickening monument to their breathtaking cruelty and lack of human empathy. I placed the detailed invoice from the corrupt psychiatrist right on top of the medical evaluation, clearly highlighting the $50,000 cash bribe they had paid to chemically imprison my mind. Second, I placed the forged corporate property deed next to the medical file. I specifically circled the fraudulent signature on the bottom line, the exact forgery Derek had utilized to illegally transfer the estate directly into his own name. I wanted him to see the physical evidence of the federal felony that would ultimately ensure his stay in a maximum security penitentiary. Third, I pulled my old smartphone from my coat pocket and placed it squarely on top of the forged property documents. I left the device wiped of all personal data, but kept the audio application open on the main screen. I queued up the exact digital timestamp of their horrific parking lot conversation. All Derek had to do was push a single button to hear his own arrogant voice boasting about stealing my corporate empire and plotting my permanent institutionalization. The physical arrangement on the marble island was a stunning masterpiece of absolute retribution. But the presentation still required a final finishing touch to ensure the psychological destruction of my enemies. I reached into the utility drawer and pulled out a bright red permanent marker. I grabbed a blank sheet of stationery paper from the kitchen desk and placed it flat on the marble counter next to the carefully arranged documents. I uncapped the marker and took a slow, deep breath, centering my thoughts. I pressed the tip firmly against the pristine white paper. My handwriting was sharp, jagged, and entirely devoid of any trembling weakness. I wrote the words with a slow, deliberate cadence, ensuring the bright red ink bled heavily into the stationery. I wrote, "Do not bother calling the ambulance." I paused, letting the anger flow directly through my hand and into the marker. I moved down to the next line and continued writing with unforgiving clarity. "And definitely do not bother checking your bank accounts." The message was short, brutal, and utterly devastating. It was the perfect, terrifying realization of their absolute failure. I left the red marker resting on the counter next to the note. When Derek and Monica finally walked down those stairs to eagerly await my medical extraction, they would not find a helpless, medicated old man. They would find the undeniably physical proof of their own impending doom. They would realize in one blinding instant that their Cayman getaway fund was vaporized, that their secret medical conspiracy was exposed, and that the relentless, heavily armed fury of the federal government was already marching directly toward their front door. I picked up my duffel bag and swung the strap over my shoulder. I did not look back at the grand kitchen or marble foyer. I walked out the front door and pulled it shut. The latch clicked loudly in the morning air, sealing the tomb they had carefully dug for themselves. The sky above Columbus was brightening into a pale blue as the sun slowly breached the horizon. I walked down the driveway and climbed into the freezing cab of my pickup truck. I tossed the bag onto the passenger seat and turned the heavy key. The engine roared strong and unburdened. I shifted into gear and pulled away from the estate without a shred of regret. I navigated the quiet streets, merging onto the wide lanes of the interstate. The long road stretched out infinitely before me, clear and free of the toxic deception that had clouded my life for so long. I rolled down the window just a fraction, letting the biting wind rush into the cabin and wash over my face. I was stripped of my massive wealth and my corporate title, but I had successfully preserved the only thing that truly mattered. I had fiercely defended my absolute sovereignty, my brilliant mind, and my human dignity against those who sought to bury me in the dark. I was finally completely free. The heavy wheels of my vintage Ford pickup truck devoured the long stretches of black asphalt as I merged onto Interstate 77. It was exactly 8:15 in the morning. I was steadily driving south, leaving the freezing, miserable winter storms of the relentless Ohio season entirely behind me, deeply eager to embrace the brilliant warmth of the southern states. My destination was the bright, sunny coast of South Carolina, a place where the bitter cold of betrayal could not reach me. Inside the quiet cabin of the truck, the only sound was the steady, rhythmic humming of the powerful engine carrying me toward my new life. I felt a profound, incredible sense of absolute peace settling deep into my bones. The suffocating weight of my massive corporate empire was gone, replaced by a thrilling, pure sense of total freedom. Suddenly, a sharp, piercing electronic ringtone shattered the comfortable morning silence. The aggressive sound came from a cheap, untraceable burner phone resting lightly on the worn passenger seat. I had explicitly purchased the disposable device with untraceable cash just hours before I departed strictly for this exact moment. I calmly reached over, picked up the small plastic phone, and pressed the green accept button. I lifted the cheap speaker to my right ear without saying a single word. "Dad, what did you do?" Derek screamed through the tiny speaker, his voice cracking with sheer, unadulterated panic. I listened to the magnificent sound of his entire world actively collapsing into absolute ruin. He was audibly hyperventilating, struggling to pull oxygen into his lungs, as the horrifying reality of his situation finally crushed him. The arrogant, composed chief executive officer who had smugly planned my permanent medical incarceration was completely gone. In his place was a terrified, weeping child who suddenly realized he had stepped into a lethal trap. "The money is completely gone!" Derek wailed, his voice ascending into a frantic, high-pitched shriek. I tried to initiate the Cayman transfer, but the entire corporate holding account was locked. Then I checked my personal accounts, and the bank says my balance is zero. "We have absolutely nothing left, Dad. Please, you have to fix this." The FBI is currently swarming the lobby of the headquarters with federal warrants. They are seizing all the hard drives. You have to help me. I kept my tired but intensely focused eyes locked firmly on the long gray highway, stretching out endlessly before me, refusing to let his desperate tears penetrate my fortified emotional armor. I did not raise my voice. I did not match his frantic, pathetic energy. I spoke with the chilling, absolute calm of a man who had successfully reclaimed his stolen soul from the darkest depths of hell. "You explicitly told me to stop wasting your money, Derek," I replied smoothly, letting the cold reality of my words pierce straight through his hysterical sobbing. "I did exactly that. I secured the funds, exposed your medical conspiracy, and handed your illegal cryptocurrency ledgers directly to the federal government. I am simply honoring your request to step aside. Enjoy your bankruptcy, son." I pressed the end button permanently, severing the connection, before he could utter another desperate, pathetic plea. I grasped the cheap plastic burner phone tightly in both hands and snapped the device cleanly in half. I rolled down the driver's side window, letting the fresh morning air whip violently into the cabin. I tossed the shattered plastic pieces out onto the highway shoulder, watching them violently bounce and rapidly scatter into the fine gravel and thick dust of the roadside. The early Carolina sun crested over the distant horizon, casting brilliant rays of golden light across the windshield. The warm light bathed my face, melting away the lingering traces of the cold, dark nightmare I had just escaped. I pressed my foot heavily on the accelerator, driving into absolute freedom. Let my story be a harsh warning to anyone who builds an empire for their children. Love your family deeply, but never let parental devotion blind you to greed. Trust is a beautiful thing, but blind trust is a weapon you hand to your enemies. If your children see your lifelong sacrifices as an entitlement rather than a privilege, cut the cord before they cut your throat. A true legacy is not built on leaving behind a mountain of cash for ungrateful heirs. It is built on demanding respect, keeping your dignity intact, and having the courage to walk away. If this story opened your eyes, please hit that like button to support a father who fought back. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss these harsh truths. Drop a comment below. Where are you watching from? And what would you have done to Derek? Stay sharp, stay strong.